Hello, folks. Come take a load off at the Holiday Inn. But be warned, Universal actually foots the bill for this place. So if you bring your audio tracks with you, they're probably gonna get scrubbed even further of detail.
Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade. This is a review of the recent Universal 4K UHD and new master of the 1942 holiday classic Holiday Inn, which of course is most famous for giving the world the iconic song White Christmas tied to its Christmas segment. The film is, it's essentially a vehicle for Irving Berlin classics and what were to be destined classics, and of course, White Christmas being the most famous of them. The loose idea of the film is that you have a holiday be reflected by a particular song, so of course, the songs are the main attraction, aside from the star pairing of Bing Crosby with Fred Astaire. So, this is not a film you necessarily come to for its narrative, and for me, that's probably the biggest drawback is that it's really more of just a vehicle for the stars performing these incredible numbers. So it's a film that's much more about the atmosphere and the actual music itself. So it's not a film that has a very strong narrative, unfortunately. It has enough of a narrative through line, but it's more about getting from one song sequence to the next. And the loose sort of idea that develops is that the Bing Crosby character is tired of the show business life and decides to go off and purchase a farm estate and then decides to turn it into an inn that's only open for actual holidays. So that's why they need to have song and dance numbers for specific holidays. And so we literally see the film then become centered around each and every holiday. And over time, it became a cherished Christmas film, even though the actual Christmas segment of it is only a certain portion, and it's not like you're constantly seeing snow and wintry visuals throughout, only in the select winter holiday sequences. I think this film was very much the inspiration for what they later refined into White Christmas, which, of course, also starred Bing Crosby and also was a vehicle for incredible Irving Berlin songs, but that I think has a more definite and much stronger narrative and is more obviously Christmas themed, even though it is still a film that goes over different seasons. It's not all set at Christmas. It is very much obvious that it was patterned after Holiday Inn because they even get to a point in that film where the action gets centered around an inn that's down on its luck that they're trying to resuscitate financially and business wise with putting on shows. So I think it's very obvious to draw parallels between the two because White Christmas very much is building off of what Holiday Inn already did. But with that film, I think you have a much stronger narrative, much better developed characters, and of course, it was the first film to be shot and photographed in VistaVision, which of course was Paramount's incredible high fidelity motion picture system during the widescreen revolution. So it has incredible visuals. But the greatest aspect of White Christmas that you don't find in Holiday Inn is the fact that it was directed by the great Michael Curtiz, who could direct any genre and make it seem like he was an old hand at it because he was arguably the greatest director who ever lived. So that's the biggest key difference between Holiday Inn and White Christmas, aside from the more developed narrative. But it's very obvious that that later film is very much sort of piggybacking off of the success of Holiday Inn, and of course reprises the most famous song from Holiday Inn and actually makes it the title of the film. So I think it's impossible to look at these two films separately, since they're very much joined together at their core. So Holiday Inn's successfulness with audiences is going to depend on if they're classic musical fans, if they're Bing Crosby or Fred Astaire fans, or fans of Irving Berlin, or just classic musicals in general. The film was directed by Mark Sandrich, who directed several of the iconic Astaire and Rogers musicals at RKO, so he was no stranger to this. But it is always obvious that the film is merely a vehicle for the songs, and you only have the two lead stars as the real standouts in terms of all of the individual music numbers. It's a film that people either can enjoy to a certain extent, or they absolutely love it because they watch it every year as a holiday classic, as part of the regular holiday rotation. It might be a bit of an acquired taste for some if you're not as much into classic musicals, but it's also fitting into the way that Bing Crosby would usually be paired with another star, whether you think of his pairing with Danny Kaye and White Christmas, which is very much patterned after his pairing with Fred Astaire here. And in that film, originally it was apparently supposed to have been Fred Astaire, but he couldn't do it or didn't want to do it for various reasons. So that's why you have a different version of this same pairing in that film, and another link between the two. But of course, you have to think about the Crosby and Bob Hope road pictures. So it's interesting to note that Bing Crosby is always usually paired with another star at the time, and usually the best moments are in any of these films the interplay between Crosby and whichever other star he's paired with, and it's the interplay and the sort of bickering back and forth that really keeps audiences entertained. We have enough of a sort of plot setup to get us into the main thrust of the film in terms of the actual idea of a show businessman getting tired of the life and buying a rundown old inn and deciding to try and spruce it up in his own unique manner, and then needing a bunch of holiday numbers in terms of new material to perform when the inn is open only for holidays. That gets us into the main thrust of the story, but then it's very much apparent that the film is just a vehicle for the musical numbers. So for me personally, that's why it's always felt a little bit short in comparison to other films, and it also, I think, lives in the shadow of its better, improved, more famous successor in White Christmas, because, again, that film very much just replicates the same structure and a lot of the same elements and even the same star and the most famous song from Holiday Inn. And it's hard to go back and look at this film without thinking of the, I guess technically you'd say the more polished second version that came later. But this is still an interesting film. It's got a lot of really nicely staged musical numbers, of course. Fred Astaire gets to do some wonderful dance routines, and there's a certain charm to it. It's also a bit longer, as most musicals were at the time. So it runs around 100 minutes, which for this particular story, I think is probably a little bit much. But you also have to keep in mind that we have all the different musical numbers for all the different holidays of the calendar year, and they get into the more obscure holidays as well. So it's not just the major ones. So at least we do get that sense of the passage of time, and we do get little bits of more story development. But for me personally, I just always wish it had more, and it wasn't quite so obvious that this was just a vehicle for the amazing songs. Of course, when you look at this film now, and really ever since I first saw this film as a kid, it was very obvious even then. One of the song numbers is a minstrel song number that is performed in blackface, and it's very cringy, to be honest. It's not really necessary to be here in this film in terms of the setting didn't exactly call for a entire blackface number, but it was still a part of performance at the time, and a lot of the people who were making this film did sort of work their way up in show business doing numbers like this, especially on the stage and in vaudeville. So it was still, unfortunately, a part of the American stage tradition. So it's very jarring when you see this film for the first time if you're not expecting that to pop up. It's obviously not something that would have been approved even, a few years later, but it's very much an obvious product of its times. And thankfully, in this new release, they have made an entire extra, which is the only new extra, but they have made an entire separate piece examining this further from a modern context and also discussing the historical context. So I think that's very important for people who have never seen this film before, and that number comes up and you're like, oh dear. So it's done ostensibly to tie into Lincoln's birthday and being viewed as the great emancipator, but it wasn't necessary, really. But at the time, it was obvious that people weren't necessarily thinking about how this would be viewed by everybody else and how it was insensitive. So you will run into this stuff with even films of the 1940s. So it's obvious that it was a product of its time, and it's just one of those things that pops up that you're just like, okay, this is certainly cringy and awkward. Okay. So it's good that there is now an additional extra that discusses this in greater detail and context, so people can have that context and think about the issue further. But again, just be forewarned, if you've never seen this film before, that does pop up for that particular number. So certainly expect to be cringing during that entire sequence. But thankfully, that is the only example in the entire film. Universal has somewhat supported the film continually, kind of branding it as a holiday classic title, and it still pops up in rotation. So it is one of the films that I think people know of, at least to a good amount, as a holiday film. So I think that's what's kept it in perpetual video releases and occasional television broadcast airings, as opposed to other holiday films that unfortunately don't have that sort of standing in the general public's mind. So this is one of those films that I think never quite left the pop culture idea of what a Christmas or holiday film is. And that, of course, is why I think we've now got this new 4K master and UHD release from Universal. So to talk about the picture quality, this is a brand new 4K scan of the best surviving elements, and I think visually is a dramatic upgrade over the previous Blu-ray, similar to what we've seen on the recent Universal Classic Horror and Hitchcock titles, especially the black and white ones, compared to the previous Universal Blu-rays. The HDR here is HDR10 because Universal does not opt for Dolby Vision, and thankfully it doesn't have the issue that I have on the Classic Horror UHDs, which unfortunately had too much brightness in terms of the nit usage on certain areas of the frame, which did cause unfortunate pop-out effects and certain light sources and white or bright objects to be too bright and have that sort of popping out at you and being far too bright compared to everything else in the scene. You don't have this happen in Holiday Inn, so I was very pleasantly surprised that was not an issue here. Of course, this is still HDR, so it is going to be brighter than what was on the old Blu-ray, but I think it's properly handled here, so I don't have an issue with the HDR presentation, which is nice to see on a Universal title because they kind of have a spotty history in terms of their HDR application on catalog titles, with some of them unfortunately having a bit overzealous HDR approach, and it's not good on a catalog title, especially a black and white catalog title, to have any sort of pop out effect, because it's even more apparent on black and white titles than it would be a color film. So I was pleased to see that wasn't an issue here. Now, you will need to expect that just like the classic horror UHDs, this has not been meticulously and 100% cleaned up in terms of eradicating all signs of damage and wear. There is still an occasional bit of specks or marks or light scratches or light lines that pop up. Most of these were in the previous Blu-ray, and you can tell by comparing that on this 4K master they have been addressed better. So they've been basically dialed down more, but not completely eliminated. So just like what we saw on the classic horror UHDs. So I think visually this is probably the best that can be done with these elements. They're also not obviously working from the original negative, because there are certain portions that are obviously coming from a lesser source because they look a little soft or doopy, and they're obviously of lesser quality. So at several points there are going to be short little segments that you need to expect there's going to be a bit of a quality dip, but again, I think even those have been handled as best as possible, and you don't notice the jump back and forth between the quality of the footage as much, because they have taken the time to try and blend those as best as possible. Nicely, this does retain the original Paramount logo at the start, and you will notice there's a little tiny bit of natural movement in the opening and closing titles. Interestingly, we also have a new disclaimer about the film, which is basically about the musical number that has blackface. So that's why that's here, and it's a nicely worded, simple disclaimer at the start, basically saying that this has to be looked at in its historical production context and does not reflect the viewpoints of Universal in 2023-2024, obviously. So that's why that's here. I don't think previous releases had a disclaimer like that, and I think they did this obviously because they've also now made a new featurette, short extra, specifically about discussing that particular scene in greater detail. So that was an understandable, nicely worded disclaimer. So that's here on this 4K presentation as well. Now we turn to the audio, where we have a major, gigantic problem. This has a lossless presentation of the original mono mix in DTS HDMA 2.0, so dual mono. Now, most Universal Catalog UHDs are typically recycling the audio track that was on their previous Blu-rays. And with Universal titles, that means you're usually recycling a lossless track that unfortunately has had varying degrees of noise reduction and EQ applied over the years. Now, some UHDs are brand new audio transfers, particularly when there's been a restoration. So those are usually left alone and sound great. Unfortunately, there are certain UHDs from Universal where they're not simply porting over the already noise-reduced and manipulated Blu-ray track, but they're manipulating that track even further to sound cleaner, or I guess better in some people's crazy ideas of what better means. But unfortunately, that's the case with this release, and the Blu-ray mono already did not sound super great. But what they've gone and done is applied even more noise reduction and further processing, so this sounds dramatically worse than the Blu-ray, which itself was already a worse sounding version of the DVD audio track. Now, over at the Bad Audio on Blu-ray blog, known as Blu-ray, who's a great friend of this channel, they've done one of their great write-ups on comparing the audio tracks of this film from different releases. And I shared some of my samples and notes, because the only old release I have before the Blu-ray and UHD is the old Encore Laserdisc from the late 80s, which is an old Universal disc, not a very good transfer, and of course it's got analog audio, because this was long before Universal started springing for digital PCM tracks on their Laserdiscs. But usually these are hands-off, warts and all transfers, and it would just depend on how good the element or transfer was. Now, this is not a particularly good Laserdisc transfer, and the element they had wasn't particularly very good, so this is sort of your average run-of-the-mill Encore disc that also doesn't have very good sound, and it's analog as well, which in the Laserdisc format was not particularly very good, so they would frequently be beaten out by VHS hi-fi tracks, for example, and the VHS would most likely be the same master as this, just on VHS. But this is the only major LD release, and this is the only older version I have. Now, when you look at this release, obviously the audio sounds quite poor because it's not a very good transfer and it's Laserdisc analog. But the processing that's been applied to this UHD mono track is so heavy and so bad at times that there are points in listening to this UHD mono track where it sounds just as bad and actually even worse than the old late 80s Encore Edition analog track on the Encore Laserdisc. So that was really eye-opening when I pulled this out again and did some comparisons, because this was the only other version I had. I don't own the DVD, but again, you can go over to the Blu-ray blog, and I'll leave a link in the description, so you can read their detailed comparison of the primary releases on Laserdisc, DVD, Blu-ray, and UHD. But essentially, the DVD was a new mastering of the audio, and on each release it's gotten progressively worse. So the best audio presentation of the film that we are currently aware of is the standard original release DVD, which I think was from about 2003 or so. So even though that's a lossy track, it doesn't have all this additional processing applied to it. The Blu-ray was essentially a slightly processed version with some noise reduction of the DVD. So it sounds worse than the DVD, but it certainly sounds better than this UHD. So this is a Universal disc that I think does perfectly fine in the picture department and then completely foobars it in the audio department. So this is a great upgrade for the visuals and a complete downgrade for the audio. And it's shameful that it's happening on this film, which is all about the musical numbers because it has some of the most iconic songs of the American songbook. So you would think that, you wouldn't mess with the audio of a film that's all about the songs and the musical numbers, but oh no, it's Universal. But it's not just Universal. This is unfortunately something that happens with all catalog titles. You have to do this level of comparison and research to try and figure out if there's an audio presentation on any format release of a film that has not been manipulated or had a noise reduction pass or had frankly destructive handling of its fidelity as has happened here. So this is a complete audio failure, actually, because this UHD has had its audio track so manipulated that at points it actually sounds, frankly, worse than the 1985 not very good Encore Edition Laserdisc analog mono that was from a not very good transfer, and that this whole track to begin with sounds quite poor. So for a second screwed with version of a perfectly fine sounding mono track to even approach now, and let alone sound actually worse in spots than this old analog disc from 1985, and this is on the new and improved UHD with a vastly improved 4K picture master. I mean, what are we doing here? This is literally shooting yourself in the foot. This is a perfect example of 10 steps forward and 20 steps backward, but unfortunately people don't pay attention to audio, and every review you look at for this title will say the audio is fine or sounds great, which it certainly doesn't. And especially if you then take the time to make some additional comparisons, you can very quickly see how poorly the audio has been treated. So essentially, you have to pick up this UHD for the new video presentation and then make a capture of the old DVD lossy mono and then sync that to this release to have the best available picture and sound. And that's absolutely ridiculous. So unfortunately, the audio presentation here is a complete failure and ridiculous because it didn't have to be this way. All they had to do was leave the audio alone. It would have been better if they just ported the Blu-ray audio straight like they usually do. Then we would have just had a slightly noise-reduced and manipulated version of the DVD audio track. And that's what was on the previous Blu-ray. But no, they had to screw with it further. So that's why with Universal Catalog titles, you have to look at the so-called original option, or if they just have that and no unfortunate remix, most of the time it's going to be just a random chance. Is it just the Blu-ray audio copied over, or did they screw with it further? Well, here's a perfect example of when they screw with it further and they make it catastrophically worse. In terms of the packaging and artwork design, this is a nice modern cover. It has this slipcover, which actually has some texturing on it. I don't know how obvious this will be on camera, but it's sort of a shiny effect to give the effect that it's a snowy looking image. We have a rather standard looking rear, and then of course the same art is on the standard case, so eventually they'll just stop making the slipcover. So here we have the case with the same artwork and of course a little bit more info because they actually print about the extras on the case and not the slipcover. You open to find the new UHD with the new cover artwork, and then a newly printed Blu-ray, which is newly printed because they added the new extra to it and changed the menus, but otherwise it seems to be identical to the older Blu-ray master. Now, all the supplements are carried over from the older releases, so these are all legacy extras shot over the years at various times and in various formats, except for the new piece that I mentioned before. So you have the long interview / appreciation piece with Fred Astaire's daughter. We have entire pieces about the musical numbers and the songs, of course. And then we have the audio commentary, which was by Ken Barnes with some older interviews interspersed as well. That was done for previous and past releases, so that's been ported over as well. The new piece, again, is entirely about the Abraham musical number, which is the blackface number. And this is a 2022 piece, so it was obviously done, shot, and made for this particular release, and that's why the Blu-ray has been re-encoded to now include that as an additional supplement. This is a good little examination of the scene and its historical context, but also helpful for those who are just coming to the film and are definitely going to be thrown by that as they get to it for the first time, and then they're just going to be doing, I think, what we all do, the classic, oh dear, this is not good. But anyway, it's good that they did take the time to make a supplement about this particular scene to, again, give people more things to think about, more facts, and more of the historical context to be able to explain that sequence. And also why it's important to not alter the film, to remove it, as some older versions did. I think some old TV broadcast and certain older versions did just remove that scene entirely. So it was nice that they did take the time to make an additional supplement about that, but that is the only only new supplement on this release. Also, when you get into some of the other pieces, they're not only recycled over, but they're also very old standard presentations. And Universal frequently does this. And of course, the trailer is this way as well. So the film's original trailer is included, but it is of very low quality in terms of it being a very old standard definition file that is now being upscaled all the way to 4K. So it looks really crummy. So ultimately, the Universal UHD upgrade of Holiday Inn does yield remarkable results with this new 4K Picture Master, and we have the new 2022 Extra, which is very helpful and nice to see for discussing the one very troublesome scene in the film. The new artwork is pretty nice. The new slipcover is admittedly nice, and it's frequently on sale for less than $15, so it's definitely at a nicer price point. Unfortunately, the major problem is the handling of the film's audio, which has once again been manipulated and manipulated further than what was on the Blu-ray, to the point of it at times sounding worse than the old crappy Laserdisc pressing from 1985. So unfortunately, I can recommend this disc in all aspects except for its handling of the audio. And to have better audio, you technically have to go and get the old DVD and use its lossy mono, which is basically an untouched version or a less messed with version of the audio that was then made to sound worse on the Blu-ray and now made to sound even worse on this UHD. So do keep that in mind when looking at this title. It is still a great title to pick up to see a nice studio catalog UHD release of a new 4K Picture Master of a 1940s film, and we do need to support classic studio era films on UHD wherever possible to let studios know that these are important films and we will purchase them. But it makes it frustrating when you do that and then you find something like this where the audio has been treated horribly, and for it to sound worse than the old Encore Laserdisc in spots is just insane, because again, this is not a very good sounding disc. It sounds quite poor, as most early Encore discs do, unfortunately. So that's the real aspect of this release that infuriates me and is the major red flag. This should be addressed. This should not have been done, and this practice needs to stop, because there's no reason to do this to vintage audio. But unfortunately, other people who control rights and do have the ability to do these things feel differently, and frequently audio is the one element that flies under the radar or gets swept under the rug, and it's just a couple of us people who start digging into this material and finding out about this stuff, trying to get people to listen, but unfortunately studios don't seem to care. So again, the picture quality here is lovely. The new 4K Master is a gigantic improvement. We have all the old legacy extras plus the new extra, and the artwork is nice along with the nice lower price point, but the audio is a complete failure and quite frankly sounds frequently terrible. And again, for it to sound worse than a not good Laserdisc from 1985 is, I mean, that just says everything. So Universal does need to address these audio issues that they continue to cause on their catalog titles, and all studios and labels need to pay more attention to properly treating audio, even if it means offering a so-called purist or archival audio option as a secondary track, even if you have to label it an unrestored audio presentation. That would be the way to go, and then you can have that alongside your latest and greatest audio desecration in terms of noise reduction and EQ all you want to. So in short, this is a lovely UHD in all aspects except for its audio, which is frankly terrible and just about the worst audio presentation this film has had, which is really sad because this film is entirely about the iconic music numbers and songs. So this should be a film where the audio was at least treated with more respect and care and attention, and that has not happened. They've actually made it sound worse than the Blu-ray, which already sounded worse than the DVD, and that's unfortunately the situation with this UHD release, which is representative of the Universal releases that do this in terms of taking the already not good sounding Blu-ray audio and manipulating and processing it further. So again, This is a great upgrade for picture quality. It's at a very low price point, but the audio is terrible. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films, holiday films as well, and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I hate to be so negative about this release's audio track, but I was very surprised to go back to my old Encore Laserdisc and find that in places the new UHD audio sounded worse than an old disc from 1985 that I remembered as not being very good, and it's not very good. So yeah, that just got me all hot and bothered. So I started digging around further. And again, I would encourage people to go look at the lovely post on the blu-ray blog for further information. And definitely go and pick up a copy of the original DVD, which I myself am also going to do because that is significantly better than the Blu-ray audio as well. Otherwise, this is still a nice upgrade over the previous Blu-ray. And I still encourage people to pick it up, especially when it's on sale, sometimes for less than $10, and show your support for purchasing classic era studio films in the 4K realm on UHD releases. But it's unfortunate that we can't get a perfect archivally minded release in both picture and sound without any major issues. I was happy seeing that this didn't have some of the issues from the Universal Horror UHDs, and that the HDR was more tasteful, but then having gigantic audio problems, sometimes even worse than some of the stuff that's been long-standing with the Universal Horror films, was very unfortunate. So again, with audio, it's very hit or miss with Universal, just like it is for every major studio and label, unfortunately. So as always, please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels, even when they have really screwed up audio presentations, by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive, and of course also purchasing older format releases to search for the best audio track, and then combine that with the new UHD in terms of the 4K master and make your own version with unproblematic sound. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.